bacteria isn't all bad. I know what you're thinking. You hear this all the time, that bacteria is something we need to get rid of. With our antibacterial gel and our antibacterial wipes, they're everywhere. But did you know that a healthy body actually has 39 trillion microbes that help it to run smoothly? Good bacteria is everywhere, as it should be. Bread. Made from the simplest of ingredients, flour, water, and yes, bacteria, those ingredients with a good amount of time, skill, and regulated temperature make this loaf one of the tastiest and healthiest of foods. Let's find out how. Where does this bacteria come from? All around us, actually. If you were to combine 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water and let it sit long enough, somewhere in there, it's going to get bacteria and start producing bubbles. Over the next few days, if you were to take a little bit of starter and equal amounts of flour and water, each day it would develop even more until you've created a bubbling concoction of fermented flour and water. Day 1 starts by mixing together 100 grams of your starter, 100 grams of your flour, and 100 grams of water. Bacteria and yeasts in the container start to munch on the flour. As it's eating, the bacteria emits carbon dioxide. This creates bubbles that cause the mixture to rise. That carbon dioxide is what gives the sourdough bread its delicious flavor. At that point, it's ready to be made into dough. The bread making process starts by heating up water so it's warm enough to help fuel the bacteria in their growth, but also cool enough that it's not going to kill off the bacteria. Once that water is warm enough, it's added in with the starter and whisked until fully incorporated. Then you add in the flour. Once the flour has been stirred in and fully incorporated, then it's time for the autolyze sequence. This can go from anywhere from 1 hour to 4 hours, but all it is doing is hydrating the dough and allowing those bacteria to get a head start on their munching of the flour that you've just added. It's important to note that salt has not been added at this point. Salt is a flavor enhancer. It helps everything to taste better, but it also kills yeast and bacteria if there's too much of it. So it's not added until after that autolyze sequence. It allows the time for the bacteria to multiply and also develop faster without being inhibited by the salt. It has to be a balancing act. You don't want to have one more than the other. The salt is added by pouring the salt over the top and then massaging it into the dough. There's going to be a noticeable texture change that goes from a lumpy, clumpy mass of just bread and water to being smooth and silky. Once the salt has been incorporated into the dough, it's time to start the folds. These folds are meant to strengthen the dough by developing the gluten network. You want to repeat the folds 4 times and then wait a half an hour and then repeat it another time. In total, you'll do 4 folds 4 times, so 16 different folds, and this will take place over 2.5 hours. During that 2.5 hours, you'll notice that the dough is going to start expanding. it's starting to get bubbles in it. You don't want to pop the bubbles because that is what's going to give growth to your loaf. However, you do want to make sure that it's stretching long enough that it's developing gluten so that it can continue to grow. That gluten is there to provide structure within the bubbles, and they can't grow without them. This is why you often see in gluten-free bread that it's very dense and it doesn't have bubbles in the actual structure of the dough or the end of the bread. You need gluten to provide a membrane in which to hold all the gas that the bacteria is letting out. After you're done with your folds, place your dough in the fridge overnight to slow down the bacteria fermentation. This is going to increase the flavor of the dough and make it extra delicious, while also increasing the amount of bubbles. The first step on the second day of this process is to take your dough out of the fridge and let it sit for 2 hours. That 2 hours is really important because it allows the dough to come back to room temperature, which also allows it to stretch and be formed into the final loaf. Once the 2 hours has passed, pour the dough onto the countertop and divide it into 2 different loaves. You're going to form those into a ball, and then once again, wait for 20 minutes while they continue to warm and develop and rise. Next, take out your bannetons. These are bowls with different ridges on the outside of them to allow for the dough to cling to and rise up further. You'll want to flour them because the dough is sticky. Then stretch the dough out until it makes a nice rectangle or a square. Then you're going to fold in as if you're making a letter. This is the tricky part. You're going to have to utilize the counter to pull the seams together until they've connected underneath, and then turn it over into the banneton for its final rise. If it is falling apart after you've gone through the circle of motion, feel free to pinch it together so it sticks once again. Cover your loaves and return them to the fridge for another 2 to 4 hours. This, once again, is going to help develop the flavor even more and help them rise one final time before they get cooked. You can see in the structure of it that there are already bubbles forming underneath the surface. These are excellent indicators that this loaf is going to rise well in the oven. About a half an hour before you're ready to cook your loaves, you need to stick your Dutch oven into the actual oven so it can heat up for at least a half an hour. This allows the pan to get hot enough that the dough will spring out once it hits the heat and create a nice, crispy, delicious shell on the outside of the bread. When the Dutch oven is ready to go, flip your loaf over and get ready to slice. You're going to use a lame, which is a kind of knife that helps to slice into the skin of the dough, but not all the way through it. You can slice however you want, but you want to make sure that you at least have 1 or 2 about 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch gash so that it helps to lift and rise the dough one more time. Place the loaf into the Dutch oven, making sure that it's in the center, and then cover up with the lid of the Dutch oven. Place in the oven and let it cook for 30 minutes. At the end of 30 minutes, you're going to take it back out of the oven, take the lid off, and then put the loaf back in the oven with the lid off so that it has one final time to get crisp. At the end of that 10-minute cook time, you should pull out a loaf that is deliciously flaky and crisp on the outside, but creamy and smooth on the inside. You can't actually slice into this loaf for another hour. It's going to continue cooking on the interior of the loaf for the next hour, and if you were to cut into it, it would make it so that it is underbaked and not quite as delicious as it could be. Once the first loaf is out of the oven, repeat the process, sticking the Dutch oven in the oven to heat for another 15 minutes. Pull it out and start again, cooking the same way that you did the first loaf. Finally comes the best part of making bread. You get to eat it. Legend has it that thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt, a bowl of porridge was left sitting out. As it sat out for days, it started to bubble, and someone had the clever idea of let's bake it. Well, that porridge turned into a delicious loaf of bread, similar to what we see now with sourdough bread. This method was used across cultures and countries throughout the world for thousands and thousands of years. And now it's replicated through fast-acting commercial yeasts that produce the results of rising and developing bubbles in bread, but not as much of the flavor or the health benefits that sourdough does. Sourdough acts like a prebiotic. It feeds the good bacteria in your gut. And as our body is made up with 39 trillion different microbes, it actually needs that good bacteria. Lactobacillus is actually the bacteria that's high in lactic acid, which makes it easier to digest and accessible to minerals. Bread truly is one of the tastiest and most delicious of foods. And who would have thought? It's all from bacteria.